If you walk into the Hurtgen wall today, the first surprise is the quiet. If you did not know what lay here in late 1944, the hush would feel peaceful until you remember a documented fact. Platoons of armed Americans marched into these trees in November and never walked out, leaving no bodies, no prisoners, no written trace. In the last days of October 1944, the U.S. First Army under Courtney Hodges was ordered to break open the western wall of Germany and seize the dams that fed the Ruhr. The Ruhr water could be released at will by the Germans to flood the Ruhr plain, stalling any springboard into the Ruhr itself. To Ike's staff, the map was clear. Take the timberland, get to the dams, finish before the snows. To the men on the ground, to the 28th Infantry Division, fresh from brutal street fighting in Luxembourg towns, nothing was clear inside the timber. Even in daylight, the Hurtgen forest reduced vision to 10, maybe 20 yards. Fir trunks like bars, wet dark canopy, strangling sound and light, the ground a jigsaw of draws and ditches. On 2 to 3 November, rifle companies of the 110th and 112th Infantry Regiments began feeding platoons forward in wedge and file formations along fire breaks and compass bearings. They carried Garens, bars, light mortars, Bangalore torpedoes, and canvas-wrapped rations. The first shock was not fire but erasure. Units that still existed on the S-3 situation map but no longer answered by voice or wire. One platoon that had checked in at 1400 was gone by 1700. Not overrun in a reported engagement. Not radioing, taking fire, simply degraded to static then to nothing. The forest swallows men. A staff captain wrote in his pocketbook. At the time the line read like battlefield gallows humor. By weeks, and it read like an operation summary. The struggle was not only steel, it was geometry in time. The Hurtgen prevented lateral view and lateral rescue. When a forward element slipped 50 yards off axis, it might as well have been a kilometer. When a radio man's whip antenna hit a branch and cracked off, the net went blind. When a wire line was cut by shell fragment or sawed clean by tree fall, a platoon dropped off the map without even firing. And when a German FO in a dug recess keyed his handset, 105s and 120s landed not by ranging shots, but by pre-registered plan, stitched on lanes no American could see. The worst part was absence of signal. One sergeant would write in an after-action recollection, "Men were not lost to a fight you could hear. They leaked away between the trees." That line, preserved in a unit history, is not poetry, it is diagnosis. A battlefield without horizons produces casualties without witnesses. Unlike a Normandy hedgerow fight, bounded and seen, the Hurtgen allowed death without report, movement without proof, and failure without a clear cause. Read from 2025, the operational wisdom is brutal but transferable, a domain that collapses sensing collapses command. Whether in fog and fur in 1944 or RF-jammed urban clutter today, the killing often begins before the contact. It begins when units go deaf and blind. The forest's advantage to the defender was not concealment alone, but information denial. American strength and artillery, and air could not apply to what could not be found. Yet in November 1944, the men pushing crest to crest did not have the luxury of doctrinal hindsight. They had wet boots, one map sheet per company, and an order that said keep pressure. They knelt in black soil under dripping limbs. They waited for shells that arrived without flash or flight sound in the muffled canopy, and they stepped off again because the line had to move. The human cost of that persistence is measured not only in Kia, but in files that say missing with no qualifying verb. By the second week, battalion logs contained lines that read like riddles. Element checked in, then vanished. Patrol sent to locate. No trace. No evidence of firefight. Assume minefield or mortar zone. No bodies, no tags, no piles of kit. Not silence from the wounded. Silence from the ground itself. As if the fight were edited out between frames. For families at home, the war was still solvable. Telegrams explained wounds. Graves gave closure. Inside the Hurtgen, the war began to produce outcomes that had no narrative. The file-building work of the state. Where, how, broke down under trees that recorded nothing. The army pressed the attack anyway. The dams still mattered. Winter still approached. Corps orders still flowed. And the forest, indifferent, sound-absorbing, sight-killing, still stood in the way. The first missing platoon would not be the last. The chapter closes on that first unanswerable datum. Men who existed, then did not, leaving the same question their officers were forced to write, flat and literal, in ink. Where did they go? When a platoon disappears in combat, the first assumption is that they've been captured. In the Hurtgen, however, even that hope quickly faded. By the morning of November 6, 1944, the 28th Infantry Division's G2 section had dispatched 2 search patrols to retrace the route of Lieutenant Robert L. Cummings' missing men, 12 soldiers from Company 112th Infantry Regiment. Last seen moving along Firebreak 8 toward a rise-marked Hill 401. None of them were found. What they discovered instead was a landscape that looked like it had been designed to erase human presence. The forest floor was shredded with root snags and buried mines, every trench half-flooded, every crater rim iced with frost. Helmets and shell casings were common. Living men were not. The patrol advanced cautiously, the sound of each footstep muffled by thick, wet pine needles. No weapon pits, no drag marks, no bodies, just scattered leaves pressed flat, as if men had lain there for a moment and then been lifted out of the world. We were walking through ghosts, one sergeant recalled. The forest looked like it had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. The tactical challenge was simple to describe, but impossible to solve. The Hurtgen's tangled terrain nullified American advantages in armor and mobility. Jeeps bogged down after 50 yards. Wire teams trying to reestablish lines were cut to pieces by hidden trip mines. When artillery came, it did not land in a clear open burst. The shells detonated in the treetops, raining wooden splinters and jagged steel like invisible shrapnel from the sky. The enemy was almost never seen. German infantry, often from the 275th Division or veteran paratrooper units, fought from small, pre-sighted bunkers covered with earth and logs, linked by narrow trenches invisible until you were on top of them. The human strain mounted fast. The wounded could not be evacuated without bringing stretcher teams under artillery fire. Food and water ran short. Even navigation fell apart. The compasses reacted erratically near buried wire, and the maps, drawn from pre-war forestry surveys, bore little resemblance to the churned, cratered terrain. One lieutenant described trying to use a map that might as well have been for another planet. In one case, a platoon from the 109th Infantry wandered 300 yards off course and ended up inside an unmarked German minefield. 5 men were killed instantly, and the survivors refused to move until nightfall. It was this environment into which Cummings' men had vanished. The reports that filtered back to battalion headquarters bordered on disbelief. A squad sent to locate the platoon's foxholes found evidence of a brief stand, expended rifle clips, 2 burned ration tins, a single bloody bandage, but no trail beyond it. They seemed to have moved uphill, wrote Sergeant William Dorsey in his after-action note. But the prints stopped at a fallen tree. No sign of drag marks, no spades, no gear, just gone. His final line, penciled faintly in the margin, read, "Asterisk feels like the forest took them." Asterisk in later years, Army historians would call this phenomenon positional drowning, a term coined to describe what happens when units disintegrate not through defeat, but through confusion. The Hurtgen was not a field of clear battles. It was a vast, suffocating maze that dissolved formations by degrees. Men vanished in a ground mist, strayed off bearings, or fell into enemy strongpoints that swallowed them whole. The Germans knew the terrain intimately. They had spent years fortifying it. 4 American units rotating in from open country fighting. It was like being blindfolded in a room full of traps. One intelligence officer noted that the pattern of disappearances matched certain pre-registered German kill zones, areas zeroed in for mortar fire and automatic weapons. But when those grids were checked later, no mass graves were ever found. The implication was chilling. The forest had simply absorbed them in fragments, scattering the remains across hundreds of yards. A war of annihilation by attrition, not by engagement. A diary entry from a young corporal named James Braddock, recovered later from his effects, summed it up best. "They tell us to keep advancing. But how do you advance into a place that keeps the men it kills? The trees don't burn, the ground doesn't move, but the forest fights back without ever showing its face. For modern listeners, the lesson resonates far beyond the battlefield. It is a warning about how confusion and silence can defeat even superior strength. In the age of drones and satellite feeds, it is easy to forget that all wars begin as wars of perception. And in 1944, the Hurtgen forest blinded everyone. By mid-November, after multiple failed search attempts, the missing platoon was officially listed as presumed Kia. Their families received the standard telegrams. Yet inside the 28th Division's command post, the officers knew the truth was murkier. There had been no firefight, no witnesses, no recovery, only absence. And absence, in war, is the hardest thing to explain. As the last of the search patrols pulled back toward Germeter, Captain Hurtgen looked over the map and said quietly, "We didn't lose men. We lost direction." The next morning, new orders came down. Continue the advance toward Wassenack. The forest had already chosen its next victims. The runner came in at dusk, staggering, mud-caked, missing his helmet, and with his rifle gone. And for a brief hour he was the only living residue of an entire platoon. He did not bring coordinates, only a path traced in memory through bursts of percussion and rain. His first sentence to the duty officer was not tactical, but anatomical. "I can't hear on the left side." Everything went quiet before they were gone. The platoon he had left at first light on November 12th was advancing in a narrow wedge along a shallow draw east of Wassenack, tasked to probe the tree line before any larger shift toward the Brandenburg-Bergstein Ridge. The radio had been failing all morning. Net traffic was intermittent, then clipped, then one way. The SCR 300's whip had been snapped by a falling limb. The handset still functioned, but range was now walking distance. The runner had been sent back to repair the wire trace and report a shortfall in mortar ammunition, a banal errand in a lethal zone. As he moved back, the forest detonated behind him. First the flat crack of a German MG-42 burst, then a platter of 81mm impacts pre-registered on the egress lane. The noise was not rolling but surgical. 3 salvos, each placed as if by ruler. When he turned to look, the draw he had just exited was becoming an airborne lattice of wood chips and metal. No shapes, no silhouettes, just a shredded volume. "We died without seeing them," he would write later in a sworn statement. "And we moved without knowing we were already alone." Battalion staff treated the runner's page-long deposition like a courtroom exhibit. The fire pattern matched mapped German kill zones. The Germans had buried microphone wire in several sectors. Acoustic triangulation meant they could fire mortars not by spotting, but by hearing boot fall and equipment drag. The platoon had walked into a geometry, not a duel. To headquarters, this was a solvable diagram, a box of ground, a time window, a weapons effect. To the runner, and to history, the net result was indistinguishable from erasure. The intelligence officer, Captain L. J. Morgan, wrote a hard line in the margin. "This is disappearance by fragmentation. No captured, no grouped dead. Not annihilation in one crater, but dissolution across acreage under canopy." The episode offered a harsh doctrine truth. The enemy did not need to beat the platoon. He only needed to atomize it beyond findability. The kill was not the end. The unlocatability was the aim. For modern ears, the principle is unervingly current. In environments that kill sensing, forests thin, radios denied now, RF jammed cities tomorrow. Loss is not binary, but unobservable. A formation is gone before the command knows it is under contact. Data dies first, then men. The Battalion S-3 drafted the after-action line exactly as it would enter the file. Platoon enter draw F at 1015. By 1125 runner, returned alone. No physical trace subsequently located. Presume remainder Kia. No conditional language. No ledger of names. No expiation. One intact man on the record. And an entire line of others migrated in a stroke from existence to presumption. The runner sat on the cot in the aid tent that night, staring at the canvas wall, repeating one sentence as if it were proof. They were still talking when I left. By morning, the map was updated, a thin black crosshatch shading the draw, and a fresh platoon was tasked to push a different axis. The war did not pause to solve the disappearance. it routed around it. The next chapter begins where procedure fails. Attempts to reopen the ground with intelligence, to find what was not found by witness or patrol, and to learn whether the forest silence was natural or engineered. The command did what armies do when reality won't resolve. It turned a paper. Beginning November 14th, regimental intelligence began pulling together everything that could substitute for eyes. Lodge card overlays from captured German posts, pre-war forestry plats, air photos for 9TAC, patrol sketches, and translated POW interrogations. If men could not be found in soil, perhaps they could be found in structure. One hypothesis hardened early. The vanished platoons might have walked into an unmapped spur of the German bunker belt shielding the Ruhr dams. The terrain here was seamed with splitterstellingen, splinter bunkers, half-room cavities revetted in timber and earth, sometimes camouflaged as windfall. These were not the grand pillboxes of the West Wall, but quiet foxholes with roofs, built to receive men and fire, then be reclosed by blast and treefall. In that architecture, aftermath leaves almost nothing. Search teams later opened several of these recesses. Inside, a few rusted tins, a wire spool, a stale pack of Gauloises, but no remains, no tags, no field kit suggesting American occupation or burial. That absence cut two ways. Either the missing never reached these bunkers, or they did, and were removed before evidence cooled. A bland sentence in the G2 summary said it without drama. No material residue consistent with combat departure. The staff then chased German paper. POWs from the 275 Infantry Division and the 89 ID were grilled for any record of captured Americans in that week. None admitted to taking prisoners in those grid squares, and no German Lage maps from that sector annotated a haul of POWs. For once, enemy paperwork reduced the mystery. The other side's files did not claim what ours could not find. The question metastasized. If not killed in place and not captured, what transaction absorbed them? A lesson flickered through the margins of the analysis. Even a large, exhaustively recorded war contains blind pockets where fact cannot colonize terrain. The Germans had not needed to explain the absence. Only the U.S. did, and could not. In later doctrinal notes, this chapter of the Hurtgen was cited as an epistemic failure, not merely a tactical one, a battlefield that defeated knowing. For today's listener, that matters beyond nostalgia. Modern staffs still expect the archive to make sense of the fight after the fight. Hurtgen is a warning. When the domain scrambles, sensing and burial is granular. The file remains permanently underfilled, not because analysts are lazy, but because the field denies closure as an effect. The official after-action closeout for the inquiry was antiseptic. Disposition of missing platoon remains indeterminate. One sentence to replace 12 men. No elaboration, no footnotes, no map pin, only a period. And so the file closed in ink, though the ground never confessed. The war, however, did not wait for truth. Orders were already cut to resume the push toward the Ruhr dams, and the forest still had depth to spend. By late November, the drive toward the Ruhr had become what veterans later called a meat clock. The advance ticked forward by hours and bodies, not by map lines. The 28th Division bled itself white on slopes and timber seams for objectives that yielded no decisive lever. Staff officers began using hard language in private. The Hurtgen was no longer a campaign, but a conversion, trading battalions for yards. In Washington and London, the fight barely registered. In the forest, it devoured brigades. Medcap stations overflowed. The walking wounded were sent back in after aspirin and a bandage because there were no replacements. The damn mission, sound on a staff board, was dissolving men in the wrong season on the wrong ground. This is attrition without aim. One anonymous margin note complained in a V Corps folder. But orders held. Pressure buys time, and time buys the Rhine. Post-war analysts looking back with cold ledgers judged the math brutal. The Hurtgen yielded nothing commensurate. No armor breakout, no rail choke, no decisive shatter of German C2. What it did yield was a class of losses that never recomposed in a narrative. MIAs not attached to any annotated fight. The Germans left no boast of captures. The Americans left no confirmed graves. Absence survived the armistice. When the army went hunting in documents after victory, POW tables, German Lage files, burial reports, graves registration grids, nothing closed the missing cases from the draws. The archival combing was thorough. The result was not ambiguity by neglect, but ambiguity after best effort. AG 2 officer finally wrote, on the folder spine in 1948, 5 words that read like an epitaph of the whole forest. They did not go over. They went under. There is a modern relevance baked in that blunt sentence. War remembers what it can corroborate. In domains that manufacture debris and deny pattern, whether a forest in 1944 or dense cities under censor denial today, disappearance can be a designed outcome, not an administrative accident. A force that cannot publish the fate of its dead loses moral leverage and calendar resolve. For families, the absence aged badly. The telegrams said presumed in lieu of verbs. Each Christmas letter home restated the same 2 sentences because there were no new sentences to send. For 50-plus viewers old enough to have held such telegrams or to know someone who did, this is not a curiosity of archives. It is an unfinished room in memory. When the post-war paper trail reached its ceiling, the army closed the search with a bureaucratic mercy. Case open, evidence exhausted. That is how Hurtgen wrote its final insult, by forcing history to end a paragraph without a clause. The war then pivoted, as wars do, to the profitable fights. The missing remained behind in the quiet that made them vanish in the first place. Decades after the artillery stopped, the Hurtgen forest continued to resist disclosure. Battlefield archaeologists, MIA recovery teams, and volunteer groups walked the same draws with GPS, pin flags, and ground-penetrating radar. They found cartridge fans, twisted bandoliers, and the familiar confetti of treetop blast, but never the coherent scene that would let a family say, here. It was as if the war had been shredded into particulate evidence. The science got better, the closure did not. Soil cores exposed bone chips with no anatomical continuity, fragments of enamel with no skull, steel tags corroded blank. In other theaters, Normandy, the Bulge, the Vosges, finds often reconstruct episodes. In the Hurtgen, they merely prove fighting happened, not how men left the story. The forest still withholds the narrative bridge between alive and gone. Researchers came to a grim consensus. The forest did not preserve, it dispersed. Men were killed in segments across blast volumes, then buried and unburied in seasonal churn. No single pit to exhume, no bunkers of prisoners to explain capture, no diary cache to map the last hour. The mystery was not a locked room, but an infinite leak. For families, that meant the war never returned custody of the dead. There is a unique grief in absence. You cannot argue with a grave, but you can argue with a blank. One daughter of a missing rifleman, interviewed in the 1990s, said something that could stand as the moral index of the entire case. We did not need to win. We needed to know. The army could deliver victory on paper. The forest denied knowledge on earth. There is a modern inheritance in that humiliation. Strategic power can win the campaign and still lose the ledger of truth. A democracy fights with promises not only of arms, but of accounting, that every man sent is either returned or explained. Hurtgen is the archival scar where that promise failed. The file remains open not because of optimism, but because absence is not evidence. In official registers, the missing still occupy a line, a hyphen between dates. In the timber, nothing contradicts their loss, and nothing completes it. The quiet that began their disappearance now curates it. Thus the story ends as the forest demands, not with answer, but with residue. The ground is mapped, the war is written, the archives are closed, yet the disappearance is still active, unfinished. The Hurtgen keeps its margin, and history, lacking a body, must live with a sentence that has no period.